welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning into the show. If you have a question or a comment, send it to comment@am950radio.com. So before I get into next week's show, or this week's show, I want to talk to you about next week's show, which is going to air on April 19th and 20th. So I'm going to be doing an interview of State Senator Lindsey Port for the whole show. So she represents Senate District 55, which includes the Burnsville, Savage, and Lakeville areas. So I met her at a housing forum that I talked about last week. And she agreed to come on the show to talk about a variety of topics, including affordable housing. She is the chair of the Committee on Housing and Homelessness Prevention in the Senate, so we'll be talking about that. But other things like how she got into politics, why she decided to run, that sort of stuff, highlighting some of the civics aspect of politics, and why she thinks it's important that we the people get involved with the politicians. So those are some of the things that we're going to talk about. So again, that's next week's show, which is going to be airing on the 19th and the 20th of April. So make sure you check out that show. It's going to be a good one. So for today's show, first thing we're going to talk about the 16th Amendment. Second topic is going to be about a couple of Supreme Court decisions that have come down recently. And then the last one is going to be on the tariffs and some political stuff involving that and the Republican Party too. So let's get started with the 16th Amendment. That's where we are in our little trip through the Constitution. So this amendment is one that affects nearly all of us. And the 16th Amendment is the amendment that specifically authorized the federal income tax. So I'll talk about some of the backstory here as to how we got to the 16th Amendment, but this is the one that said that Congress can now pass a federal income tax. And this is one that the Republicans love to rail against the income tax and how unfair it is and all this sort of stuff. And, you hear Elon Musk talking about it and how he's being a victim now, all this sort of thing about the federal income tax. Well, this is another one of these amendments that was proposed by 2/3 of Congress. As authorized under Article 5 of the Constitution. Remember, one of the ways you can propose a Constitution under Article 5 is 2/3 of the House and 2/3 of the Senate can vote to propose one. So that's what they did here. And this was done, like some of the other ones, some of the other amendments, this was done in response to a Supreme Court decision that they didn't like. And because of that Supreme Court decision, they thought if they just passed a federal law allowing a federal income tax, that the Supreme Court wouldn't allow it in the way that they wanted it done. So you'll see some kind of weird wording in the 16th Amendment, and that is a result of the Supreme Court decision that I'll talk about here. So here's some of the backstory that led to the ratification of this amendment on February 3rd, 1913. So in 1913, just kind of a little heads up here, this is when the era of like populism and progressivism and the populist party, right? All of this was going on in the United States. And this particular tax, this federal income tax amendment, was in part due to this type of populist uprising that the people had against the rich people. So here's some of the backstory here. So in 1861, in order to finance the Civil War, Congress passed the Revenue Act of 1861, is what it was called, in which President Lincoln supported, which authorized the federal income tax to help with paying for the Civil War, at least on the northern side or the Union side. So when the war was over, eventually Congress repealed this tax in 1872. So there was some federal income tax for, 11 years. And then Congress decided to repeal it in 1872. Back during that time in our history, and this kind of relates to tariffs today, you're hearing Trump talk about stuff like this. But back then, the federal government revenue, a lot of it came from tariffs and excise taxes. Excise taxes meaning a tax on a specific good, like a tax on cigarettes or a tax on alcohol or a tax on, stamps or something like that, right? Specific taxes on specific goods. That's what an excise tax is. Whereas tariffs, as I'll talk about later, is basically a tax on imports from other countries. So these taxes, the tariffs and the excise taxes, were affecting the poor people more back at that time in our history. Like the rich people, they could afford these taxes, whereas the poor people, and given the proportion that they were paying, these tariffs increased prices for people, prices for goods, and part of a number of the progressive groups and a lot of the farmers out west were arguing for a federal income tax. Their argument was that the income tax could be used as a progressive tax to tax the rich more. So a progressive tax basically means the more money you make, the more taxes you pay. That's what they mean by a progressive tax, which is sort of the system that we have today. I'll get to that here in a minute, though, but that's not really the system we have today. But back then, that's what the argument was. So they were basically taking money from the rich and giving it and redistributing it to the poor people. So, boy, have times changed since then. And now with all the tax cuts the rich people get and the corporations get and all the loopholes they get, I mean, the rich people don't pay the effective tax rates that you and I do. Their proportional percentage is less than what we pay. But back then, it wasn't. So after Congress repealed the income tax, so there was this movement kind of growing, like, hey, we got to start taxing the rich people more. So in 1894, so skipping forward about 20 years, Congress passed the Wilson-Gorman Tariff Act. This is also called the Income Tax Act of 1894. So that if you hear one or the other, they're talking about the same thing. And this included an income tax provision. So, not surprisingly, there was a lawsuit that went to the Supreme Court contesting this. And the Supreme Court, in a case called Pollock versus Farmers Loan and Trust Company, found that the income tax provision of that Tariff Act was unconstitutional. Now, they didn't say directly that, the income tax was unconstitutional. What they did say was the way that the payments were laid out was unconstitutional, that the portion of the income tax provisions as written was unconstitutional because it had to be apportioned among the states based on population, since it was a direct tax done in violation of Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 of the Constitution. And they also use Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3 of the Constitution, which also talks about direct taxes. So I'll get to that here in a second. But this was a decision that came from the Supreme Court, I believe, in 1895. So, the year following the passage of the law. So, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 4 says that, and I'm quoting here, no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. So there's a lot of words there, but basically what they're talking about here is the capitation part is a tax on a person. So you can tell that when the Constitution was written, of course, we had slavery back then. That's basically what they're talking about there, is a tax on a person or a tax on a slave. That's what capitation meant. Or other direct tax. So what the Supreme Court basically said here is that a direct tax is a tax paid directly to the government, which kind of makes sense, right? So this tax, and this clause was originally intended to prevent Congress from imposing a tax on slaves per person, and therefore as a way to try and tax slavery out of existence. So this was another way that the slave states got more power under the Constitution, was because of that particular clause. And they also used Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3, which basically says that direct taxes should be apportioned among the states, meaning that they're imposed in proportion to the state's population as a result of the census that was taken every 10 years. So, even though slavery was over, rich people still use that clause to try and get out of paying the income tax. And ultimately they were successful, at least in this case. So what this act actually tried to do was to put an income tax on 2% of income that someone makes over $4,000 at that time. So you can make up to $4,000 and there was no income tax. But after $4,000 in a year, you had to start paying 2% on that money that's over the $4,000. Now, how much was $4,000 back then? Well, it's roughly $100,000 today. And if you go by, well, how many people in the United States make $100,000? Well, that's less than 1% of the people. I've talked about that before in some previous shows, where there's not a lot of people in the United States that make over $100,000 in a year. So, so after this particular Supreme Court decision, Congress didn't respond with any new laws because they thought that Congress would overturn it if they tried, or the Supreme Court would overturn it again if they tried it. So that's why for a while the Congress didn't do anything. However, in 1809, so here's been about roughly 14 years or so since that Supreme Court decision. There's been more momentum built up in the populace and in the politicians during that time. So now we're starting to enter the progressive era where there's more populist people in the U.S. So in 1909, the Congress was debating what's called the Payne-Aldrich Tariff Act. So here again, notice tariffs are still part of how the federal government's getting money, even back then. So while they were debating this Tariff Act, this is when Congress proposed the 16th Amendment to the states. And it passed Congress pretty quickly in 1909. Because people were just getting mad at how much the rich people didn't have to pay taxes compared to what they were paying. Kind of sounds like what's going on today, right? But back then, there were enough people that were able to do this and get the amendment ratified. So the president back then was President Howard Taft, who was a Republican. He won the 1908 election. And he actually came out in favor of his income tax, and so did a lot of other Republicans. It's kind of funny how, when Lincoln was president, the Republicans came up with the first federal income tax. And here again, Republicans came up with this proposal for the 16th Amendment. And a lot of them voted for it. Now, not all of them, because some of them were in bed with the rich people back then. But a lot of Republicans voted for it. And, a lot of the states eventually did. Now, it took the states a little while to get up to the 36 states that were needed back then. But Delaware was the one that was the 36th state, so then it became ratified back on February 3rd, 1913. So, it took about 3.5 years or so to get enough states to ratify this, but it got there. So in 1914, so this was the first tax year that it was being used, the tax form was 3 pages long. Boy, again, times have changed since then. And by the way, Minnesota was the 33rd state to ratify this amendment on June 11, 1912. So Minnesota was one of the 36. Now, there were some states that didn't approve this, but again, you only need 3/4 of the state, and they got it. So, so now the federal income tax is the number one revenue producer for the government, even though the rich and the corporations don't pay as much as we do. But now we are paying, and we're likely to pay more if and when the Republicans pass the next tax cut. All right, so that is what's going on with the 16th Amendment. This is one of the famous ones with allowing a federal income tax. So next week again, we're going to do Lindsay Port's show. So we're not going to do the 17th Amendment then, but we'll pick it up further where we will continue on. So as we go to break here, I'm going to come back and talk about a couple Supreme Court decisions. So we'll talk to you on the other side of the break. All right, welcome back to the second segment of today's Politics Matters show, How Civics, Politics, and Law Affect You, here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So, as I mentioned before the break, I'm going to talk about 2 Supreme Court cases that just came down recently. Earlier this week, I think, for both of these. So, by the time you're listening to the show, some stuff may have changed, like some appeals may have been taken or something else. But as of Wednesday at 11 o'clock in the morning when I'm taping this is where these 2 cases stand. Okay. So the first one, I talked previously about how the Associated Press was basically kicked out of covering the White House by the Trump administration because they refused to call the Gulf of America what Trump is claiming it is called now, because he signed an executive order saying so. They didn't go along with that. They were still calling it the Gulf of Mexico, and by God, that's a mortal sin according to Trump. So they kicked out the Associated Press, and they filed a lawsuit saying, well, this violates our free speech rights, also violates freedom of the press. Although this case was more about the freedom of speech part of it. Yesterday, so this would be Tuesday, a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C., who was appointed by Donald Trump during Trump's first term in 2017, ruled in favor of the Associated Press and ordered that the Associated Press gets to have full access to cover presidential events again. So this judge is Trevor McFadden. Okay, he said in part of his ruling here that, quote, under the First Amendment, if the government opens its doors to some journalists, it cannot then shut those doors to other journalists because of their viewpoints. The Constitution requires no less, close quote. So basically what the judge ruled here is that, journalists have First Amendment rights too, just like everybody else in this country, and the president can't order them out just because you don't agree with what they're saying. They have First Amendment rights like everybody else. You, the government, doesn't have. You can't control who's covering you and who isn't. So, however, here's a little loophole that I suspect Trump will take advantage of. So the judge put a week's stay on the order, meaning it's not going to take effect right away. He gave it a week's stay so that it gives the government time to respond to his ruling or to appeal the ruling. So I suspect that the Trump administration will appeal the ruling like they will do all the time with every other case. hoping that, well, the Supreme Court will ultimately rule in his favor. So we'll have to see what happens here. But so here's like the main part of the case, right, is the Trump administration wasn't even denying what they did, basically. So there wasn't any real dispute here. Trump agreed, yeah, he gets to decide who's allowed, not the press, as is what what was happening before. So he gets to choose who gets to question the president. So basically the government is trying to control what does. And, Trump came out and said the AP is made up of, quote, radical left lunatics, close quote, like, he claims every press is, that, isn't good to him. So, and actually, if you read the Associated Press like I do, they're not radical left lunatics. I don't even know if you could call them left, let alone the other two words. So, but one thing that the AP had to do here, though, was to show, well, yeah, they got kicked out, but they also had to show they were harmed by what Trump did. So they at this hearing that the judge had, the Associated Press brought in some witness testimony that said, yeah, they lost revenue from this. Losing advertising revenue and stuff like that, and the judge agreed with them. So, I'm guessing here you're probably gonna, if stuff like this happens again, that the press is gonna file some lawsuits. So what Trump is trying to do instead is cut off funding, at least to the public stations that he has a little bit of control over, like PBS and NPR. Right, they're trying to cut off funding, federal funding for that, in the hopes that they go under, because he thinks they're too liberal too. So I suspect again we'll see an appeal, and hopefully the AP wins on appeal and wins at the Supreme Court. But who knows? And the reason that I say who knows at the Supreme Court is because of this next case that I'm going to be talking about here. So. This case involves the Supreme Court decision in a case involving the alleged gang members from Venezuela who ended up in an El Salvador prison without any due process hearing as required under the Fifth Amendment, or without any habeas corpus hearing challenging their incarceration. Now, what I mean by habeas corpus, that's a Latin term. But basically, if you are in jail, you have a right to contest the correctness or rightness, if you will, of your incarceration. Oftentimes, that's done in federal court, and these guys who were sent off to El Salvador never got that right. And notice that, as I talked about in a previous show, this due process clause and even the habeas corpus clause doesn't apply to just citizens. It applies to people, whether you're here legally or not. Right? So, you hear the Trump administration talking, oh, they weren't citizens, they're just, illegal immigrants. Well, so what? That doesn't matter under the law. So they filed a lawsuit, and the lower courts found in favor of them. It was appealed to the Supreme Court by the Trump administration, and the Supreme Court basically found for the Trump administration, at least when it comes to these particular defendants. And I'll talk about why I say that here in a little bit. But one thing the Supreme Court did do, though, is that part of their ruling was, okay, future people that the Trump administration does something similar to this, they have a right to have a hearing to challenge, their incarceration. But what part of this case was about is, well, where do you get that hearing? And the Supreme Court said, well, you get the hearing where you are incarcerated. And I'll get to that here in a little bit, too, because there's ways you can play around with that, too, if you're the Trump administration. And I think they will be doing this. So this is definitely a mixed bag decision. And at least the Supreme Court agreed that there should have been a hearing, or that there should be a hearing for future people. What the court didn't make a ruling on, well, there was lots of things, but one of them is, well, what about these guys in El Salvador? They didn't really reach that answer. Now, I think if you read the opinion, which there's a lot of dissents and some concurrence and all that stuff, it's just not clear what to do. Like the Supreme Court didn't come out and say, okay, Trump administration, you go get these guys out of the El Salvadorian prison, you bring them back here, and we're going to have a hearing in Texas, which is where they were, right, before they got shipped off to El Salvador. They didn't say that in this hearing. So there's an open question as to what's going to happen to these guys. And another question is going to be, well, let's say some lawyer files a case and the Trump administration says, well, we ain't going to get him. We can't get him. He's in El Salvador. We don't have jurisdiction over him. Tough. Make us do it. Well, then what are they going to do? What are the courts going to do then? Plus, for all we know, some of these guys are probably already dead. One of the plaintiffs that filed the case had an asylum order from a United States immigration judge saying you can't kick him out of this country and send him back to his country, which, oh, by the way, was El Salvador. He had gotten an asylum claim approved, saying he was being, he needed asylum from the El Salvadorian government because he feared for his life. Well, they threw him in an El Salvadorian prison, not just in El Salvador, but in a prison, a closed environment with, God knows some of the defendants or some of the prisoners that are in there. We don't even know if this guy's alive. Because part of the problem here is his lawyer can't see him all the time either. Now, let's hope that he is, but this is part of the problem with this decision is they don't say anything about what's going to happen to these guys that are there already. So what they did rule was that, well, because this case was originally brought in Washington, D.C., and the Supreme Court said, no, that's the wrong place. You have to bring this in Texas. So Washington, D.C. lacked jurisdiction to hear the case because these guys were detained in Texas. So they said the hearing should have been in Texas, not Washington, D.C. So they found for the Trump administration on that particular part of the case. But one thing they didn't rule on is whether the Alien Enemies Act, so this is the 1798 Act that the Trump administration is using, claiming that this act gives them authority to do what they did. Well, they didn't answer that either, not surprisingly. They ducked that issue. So, again, who knows what's going to happen to these Venezuelans? So do they still have rights? Even though they're out of our country? They didn't say. The Supreme Court didn't say. So what they did say, though, is, well, in future cases, the government has to have this hearing. So we'll see how many of them, bring their case to Texas, and then how long it's going to take to go through all the court things there. So the Supreme Court, had an opportunity to say, well, this whole Alien Enemies Act is, baloney. Because we're not at war. And, these 200 or so prisoners aren't, trying to take over the United States government or attack the United States. which is what the law, the Alien and Enemies Act basically talks about. It's only been used, it's not a coincidence, it's only been used 3 times. When we were at war, the War of 1812, World War I, and World War II. That's it. Wasn't used during Vietnam, wasn't used during Iraq or Afghanistan. Right? Because we didn't have a declared war at that time, for one thing. So, but they ducked it. They didn't make that decision. So they're going to leave it up to the lower court judges probably to make a decision here. And then they'll eventually have to make a decision because this is going to end up in front of the Supreme Court. So the Trump administration has already said, well, we don't need to bring these guys back. So, again, this is the thing to watch here. And what is the court system going to do if Trump says, well, screw you guys. I'm not going to do this. I'm going to leave those people stuck in a federal or a foreign prison for, who knows how long, the rest of their lives. How long are they going to be there? So, what are you going to do? So, here's another problem with this case. Okay, as I mentioned before, the Supreme Court said, well, you get the hearing where you are being detained. Well, not surprisingly, the Trump administration detained these people in Texas. Well, why Texas? Well, because they get favorable court hearings out of Texas. They're riddled with Republican mega judges in the state of Texas, on the federal bench and the state bench for that matter, but on the federal bench. So this decision will let the Trump administration try, at least, and forum shop, meaning if they decide they're going to detain the people in Texas, well, then the defendants have to file their case in Texas. They can't file it in, California or Washington or Massachusetts or Washington, D.C. or, somewhere else where there's, more favorable liberal judges. They're stuck in Texas or some other federal prison in some heavily Republican state. So the Supreme Court decided to let the Trump administration do that for their upcoming hearings. So another question is going to be, well, what does detention mean? Is it when you were originally arrested? Or is it where you're sitting in jail waiting for your court hearing? So some of these guys were not arrested in Texas. That's where they were being held. Eventually, they whisked them off to Texas. So if somebody was arrested in Minnesota for whatever reason, and they were sent to a prison in Texas, they would have to file their case in Texas, not Minnesota, apparently, under this decision. And then they said in their decision that, well, the government has to give reasonable notice to these people that they're detaining. Well, what the hell does that mean? They don't say what reasonable notice means. It doesn't say what it looks like. It doesn't say what information needs to be in there. It doesn't even say that they have a right to a lawyer in there. So that's going to be another question he probably litigated is, do they have a right to a lawyer at the government expense to challenge this stuff? That's going to be contested too. So another one of my criticisms of this case, again, there's many, but this is one of those cases where the Roberts Court used what's called the shadow docket, where in this case there was no public hearing, no oral arguments, very little briefing time. A couple days, I think, was all there was. Yet this decision is binding now in the future. So they basically did this behind closed doors, hence the name shadow docket, where literally they did this in a couple days. Now you may be asking, like I brought up a long time ago, boy, they sure can move fast. These Republicans sure can move fast when it benefits Trump. But boy, when we, have something that challenges the, immunity case, it takes months and months and months and months for them to make their decision. But now it's like, a couple days and we're done. We just ignore, public hearings, oral arguments, and very little briefing time. We just decided in a couple days. They hardly have any time to deliberate. And of course, the public doesn't know what's going on. The public doesn't hear this stuff. This is not how the Supreme Court of the United States should operate, but they do all the time. This has to be public, especially when you're talking about whisking away people and putting them in foreign prisons, for God's sake. But Roberts and the Republican majority on the court, they've been doing this for the years, and sounds like they're going to keep doing it. And another problem here is that the administration admitted that they made a mistake here, but yet this guy, on that one guy, and yet he's still sitting in prison all these weeks later. Like, why aren't they getting him out? Plus, the latest 60 Minutes episode reported that 75% of these people who were taken have no known criminal record. They're not charged with crimes in the United States. But the Trump administration is getting an oopsie, from the court. Oh, sorry. Sorry, the mistake was made, but they don't make them do anything to remedy the situation. So, here's a question for Justice Roberts. It's like, and all those Republicans out there defending this decision. If Biden had done this, would you let him act like Trump is doing here? Of course not. Supreme Court would, rush to say, "Oh, Biden, you can't do that." And what about if Biden had done this with the January 6th defendants, for example, taken them out of the Washington D.C. jails and sent them to El Salvador or Siberia or wherever? I mean, they would be going out. They would be saying impeach Biden, and all this sort of stuff, right? Well, now you just get crickets because your team is the one that's doing it. And unfortunately, this is the way it's going to be for a while because, unless we change the size of the Supreme Court, it's 6-3 Republican supermajority here. Republicans can basically do whatever they want. Trump was given immunity for damn near everything. And this is some shock to John Roberts and the Republicans? No. But boy, if this had been a Democrat, oh boy, they would have been all over this, right? So this is another crappy ruling by the Roberts Court, and he's going to go down in history as one of the worst Supreme Court justices of all time. In part for this decision, because you can just see where this is going to go. Right? These guys in El Salvador probably aren't going to see the light of day. And what does that mean for the rest of us when they start taking citizens and doing the same thing? Well, on that happy note, I've gone over my time, so we're going to go to break now. And when we come back, we're going to talk some tariffs. How is your retirement account doing? We'll talk about that on the other side. All right, welcome back to our third segment of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you here on AM 950 Radio, the progressive voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Now, Brett, if I recall, that song is Miss America, right, by Styx.
That it is.
Yeah, well, Miss America ain't doing so well these days.
Nope.
Not only because of the previous segment, but one we're going to talk about here, where, if you've been paying attention to the stock market, it's basically tanking. Now, I don't know what it is today. Earlier today when I first checked, it was down. But my guess is that you'll see this a lot of days where it's going to be down, it's going to be up, it's going to be down, it's going to be up. And then, whatever it is, usually down by the end of the day. Kind of like it was yesterday. But, so this segment I'm going to talk about the tariffs because, that's kind of at least the big economic news. I got, students asking me about this. I even got, colleagues at the college where I teach asking me about this because, they want to know more about it. So So we're going to take a look at the tariffs. I've talked about it before. This is not a surprise to me that this is happening. It's not a surprise you're seeing more economists saying, yeah, we're going to have a recession if these tariffs keep going on for any length of time. So the latest move, of course, was Trump increased tariffs on China to 104%. Now, I'm curious as to why it's 104. Why not 105? Why not 110? Why not 100? Where they got 104, who knows? You can say that with a lot of stuff Trump does. Who knows why he does this? But so that's what he did. And then China, not surprisingly, just imposed 84% tariffs on United States goods going into China. So, this is going to affect the stock market again. And so I went back and I looked at the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is the top 30 companies in the United States. This is the main stock market people look at. So on January 30th, 2025, so Trump had, been in for a little while, like 10 days or so. The stock market was at 44,882.13 points at that point. That was like the highest it's been in 2025. Yesterday, 30,645.59. So that's a drop of over 7,200 points from the high now to the low. And, this is, basically a little over a little over a couple of months. 6-7 weeks with this big drop. So this is over 15% of the stock market's value is gone in 2025 so far. We're just only in April. Right? A lot of it happened when Trump did his Liberation Day, a week ago, where he put blanket tariffs on, just about every country. The numbers were a little bit different, but it was basically every country. Even countries that we don't have a trade deficit with, or even countries we don't trade with, hardly at all, he still put a tariff on them. Right? So the last I looked, this does not include the last couple of days. But the stock market has lost $6 trillion with a T. $1 trillion down the tubes. Gone. Poof. Have you looked at your retirement accounts lately? If you haven't, you probably should. Because they're probably down a lot. Not just a little, but a lot. If you have your 401ks or your IRAs or whatever type you have, your pensions that invest in the markets, right? If they're in the stock market, they're pretty much down now. Not by a little, but by a lot. So we're to the point now where economists say that a bear market, this is how they define a bear market, is when the stock market loses 20% of its value. We're getting close to that now. The NASDAQ, I believe, is one that has already reached that. So the economists are saying, that's a bear market now. So all this volatility in the stock market and, dropping huge and, swinging here and there, during the day, right? This is starting to remind me of the 2007, 2008 recession, where Bush screwed things up in the economy. And, a lot of people lost jobs. A lot of people lost their retirement accounts, right? This is starting to remind me of that. So what's going on here? Well, this is another part of Project 2025. We talked about this before, a long time ago during the campaign now. And this is part of what was in there. Part of what we talked about was Trump's going to do this. Trump has been talking about tariffs since before his first term. So he said he would do this, and here we are. Now, Trump, of course, doesn't know how tariffs work, or at least he knows, but he just doesn't care and he lies about it. Which, who knows which one is true with him these days. But a tariff, all a tariff is a tax on a good that's imported in the United States from another country. That is it. Nothing very complicated. So when a United States company buys something from China to sell in their United States store, the United States company pays the tariff at the border when they bring it over the border. The country of China does not pay the tariff like Trump claims they do. The United States company does. And then the United States company turns around and raises the prices of the goods for us to pay to cover the price of the tariff. It really is that simple. Now, the government does get some money here with, that's where the tariffs money goes. It goes to the federal government. But the producers raise the prices. Now, you may be thinking, well, do they have to? Well, no, they don't have to, but a lot of them do, right? A lot of them, they would lose profit if they didn't. And businesses are all about profit, especially corporations who have a board, and they're under many state laws. They have to maximize their profits. So this is what they do. They pass the cost on to the consumer, plain and simple. Now, Trump has claimed, well, I've got $5 trillion in revenue already. Well, no, he doesn't. He's just making crap up again like he does all the time. And there's a reason why most economists don't like this blanket tariffs. So one of them is, Trump claims, well, we're going to bring back millions of manufacturing jobs to the United States because the tariffs will increase prices so that U.S. consumers will buy U.S. products instead of from these other countries. Well, that might have worked in the 1700s, 1800s, or even in the 1900s, but not now. Why? Because we have a global economy now. There just is no United States economy anymore. Technically, yeah, there is. We figure GDP and all this other stuff, but most companies in the United States, at least the big ones, right, they trade all over the world. Even small businesses sell stuff all over the world. Many U.S. companies are now overseas because it's cheaper for them to be overseas than to make it here. It's still, even when the tariffs are in place, cheaper to buy from other countries because of these tariffs. Even with these tariffs on, it's still cheaper. Producers aren't going to turn around tomorrow and start building more United States factories to make these goods. They don't have the money to do it, and they just can't do it that quick. Plus, where are they going to get the employees? We have our unemployment rate is low, right? We can't find workers because some of the immigrants have left, right? Well, where are you going to find all these workers, Trump? This thing just is not going to end up in a good place. And we're going to end up probably in a recession. So, Lindsay Port next week. Tune in for that one.